things seem to be getting more and more out of control by the day. Yesterday, the big threat from the federal government was that nuclear Armageddon is something that is directly ahead of us, impending. But I wanted to set the record straight on this and argue that that is not the biggest threat, and the very fact that this story is being paraded as the main issue should raise some suspicion about what is really the main issue. And that's what I'm going to get to the bottom of here in this video. The main threat to not only the US, but human civilization in general, is the central banks that are racking up debts that not only governments will never be able to pay, but citizens will never be able to pay. 31 trillion is the amount that the US, that's the amount of the US national debt. 31 trillion. And one might ask, now, how much does that cost to service the debt? And when we say service the debt, that means, for example, if you have a credit card payment of $1,000, how much are you paying in interest over the course of a year? If you're paying 20% in interest, then you're paying $200 in interest on that initial $1,000. The U.S. national debt cost almost $500 billion to service this year. And keep in mind, the fiscal year is different from our year, where it begins on January 1st and ends on December 31st, similar how the Chinese New Year's is different dates. The fiscal year actually it just ended and then began. I don't know the exact date, but somewhere in October. Right, so in fiscal year 2022, the U.S. paid almost $500 billion to service the debt, meaning in interest. And by 2031, they project that the cost of servicing the debt, meaning the interest on the debt, will be $1 trillion per year. So you may ask, well, what does this have to do with nuclear Armageddon? It has everything to do with it, because the claim that nuclear Armageddon is the biggest threat to human life, to human civilization, is just a flat-out lie, and it's a distraction from the issue at hand, which is that central banks are running the economies of the world into the ground, and they are setting up a scenario in which the world will return to a feudal system. As far-fetched as that sounds, that's what happens when you have unsustainable debt in the public and private sectors, and nobody is held accountable. Governments can't even hold to account their own central banks. And right, this whole smoke and mirrors occurs where people think, oh, well, it's the Federal Reserve, it's part of the government. And I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but it has nothing to do with the government. So it's a private institution. It always was. From the time it was set up in 1913, the creation of the Federal Reserve, it's just clever wording, the way they titled it. It has nothing to do with being part of the government. It is not. Yet, this institution not only sets policy that governments follow, it determines the fate of peoples and nations and everything in between. So it's important to realize that, in a way, it's actually a relief. Nuclear Armageddon, that's not the threat right now. That's the good thing. The bad thing is that the debt problem is more of a threat. It's more dangerous than nuclear Armageddon, and part of that has to do with because the prospect and the probability of nuclear war happening, in my estimation, is not what they're saying it is. Now, might that change sometime in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, in the next decade? Yes, it may. Because geopolitical things have a shelf life and a time frame on which they play out. So I think over the long term, yes, it is a concern. It is something that could be on the table, but the whole presumption that it's the biggest threat right now is really a distraction from the biggest threat, which is this hyper bubble in debt that is threatening to engulf the world and return, basically threatening to engulf the world and erase centuries of progress in the direction of prosperity. Centuries of progress out of the dark ages into the industrial age and back into the dark ages. That is what this hyper bubble in debt threatens to do. And the issue of whether nuclear war is something that is a threat in the future, I made a video on that, and I kind of was waiting to go into more detail on this more immediate topic first, but I'm going to release that video tomorrow. And it presents the argument for why it is not on the table now, but why it could be and most likely is on the table at some point in the future. So I encourage you to check that out. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.